Brought to you by the Astro Youth House chapter from STEM Arts Lab, Space on Earth is a student-led podcast that inspires listeners who are curious about space to explore the wonders of the universe through the voices of young thinkers, creators, and dreamers.
Each episode blends personal curiosity with scientific discovery, from the mysterious depths of black holes to the practical impacts of space on Earth, like GPS, climate science, and medicine.
Hosted by STEM Arts students from Taos, New Mexico, this podcast draws connections between space, art, and science, how these things all impact us here on Earth, and their meaning to humanity.
You'll hear raw, insightful conversations about topics like light pollution, the overview effect, lunar exploration, and the societal impact of the space race.
Whether you're into exoplanets, dark energy, or just stargazing from your backyard, Space on Earth makes space personal, accessible, and inspiring. We believe that space isn't just for astronauts and scientists, it's for everyone.
Join us on this adventure as we explore the cosmos from Earth, one story at a time.
Special thanks to the Lore Foundation for helping launch this podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Space on Earth. I'm one of your hosts, Wyatt Wade.
And I'm your other host, Pascal Heitzman.
Today, we are talking about NASA's MAVEN spacecraft, which has been orbiting Mars for about 10 years now. The last week, NASA officially announced that, it's dead. The spacecraft is dead. They lost contact with it back in December, and they haven't been able to get anything back. Rather than focusing on Mars's surface, MAVEN examined the planet's atmosphere and how it was gradually diminished over billions of years. Discovered a lot of interesting information. Its findings reshaped our understanding of Mars, showing how it transformed from a warmer, wetter environment into the cold, arid landscape we see today.
Why don't we start with the basics? Can you explain what MAVEN was/is and what its mission was and just what it set out to do?
Yeah. All right. So MAVEN is an abbreviation that stands for Mars Atmosphere and Volatile Evolution. N, capital N at the end of evolution. It launched on November 18th back in 2013 aboard one of United Launch Alliance's Atlas V vehicles. It arrived in Mars's orbit in September of 2014. Its first mission dedicated specifically to studying Mars's upper atmosphere. The main question was, how did Mars lose most of its atmosphere? Scientists believe ancient Mars once had rivers, lakes, possibly whole oceans, and a much thicker atmosphere, similar to Earth now. MAVEN studied how solar wind stripped atmosphere into space over billions of years. Its mission originally was planned for only just 1 year, but it operated for over 11 years.
It's so cool to see how the engineering of MAVEN was so well constructed, well thought out, that even if it was only planned to be functional for 1 year, they were able to extend it 11 times the amount of time that was initially planned. So now that we know a bit more about what the mission of MAVEN was, which was understanding Mars' atmosphere, why was that their mission?
Atmosphere controls temperature, climate, and the ability for liquid water to exist, which also means ancient Mars may have been habitable. There could have been life on Mars. MAVEN helped explain why Mars transformed from potentially Earth-like to just a cold desert with toxic air that you can't breathe. It's carbon dioxide. Most of the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. They helped scientists understand planetary evolution, climate loss, and it was also important for future astronauts on Mars.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So from my understanding, one of the ideas about it was to both study how it reflected Earth, but also if we ever wanted to have people go to Mars, we need to fully understand the atmosphere in order to create or engineer structures or spaces that could endure the atmosphere. So MAVEN was an orbital spacecraft, which means it was in the gravitational pull of Mars, which means it wasn't actually in the atmosphere. So, how did it study the atmosphere if it was orbiting so high above Mars?
Basically, MAVEN was in a highly elliptical orbit around Mars, but it would actually dip low into Mars's upper atmosphere. And then, since the orbit was elliptical, it would swing back out of the atmosphere and carried instruments to study charged particles, solar wind, magnetic fields, and also atmospheric gases. Its key instruments were the imaging ultraviolet spectrograph, the neutral gas and ion mass spectrometer, and then lastly, the solar wind island analyzer, which was built by the Space Sciences Laboratory, which is based in the University of California. Basically, it just measured how particles escaped into space.
That's really cool. I just want to quickly dip back and talk about the elliptical orbit for those who don't know. An elliptical orbit is so instead of keeping a steady or fixed distance from the planet's surface, the distance would change instead of keeping like a circle around, instead of keeping, for example, picture like a circle and then a circle with a wider radius, picture a circle, keeping it 2D for simplicity, and then an ellipse around that. So sometimes it would, as Wyatt explained, get closer to the planet and be able to dip into the upper atmosphere. But then because it's an elliptical orbit, instead of keeping it in more a circular manner, it would then go, as Wyatt once again said, into space. So you've mentioned a couple different things that they were studying, including, I think one that stands out to me is solar wind. Can you talk a bit more about like why they were studying solar wind and how it had to do with the atmosphere? And you've mentioned the climate loss and the loss of atmosphere. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So basically, solar wind is a stream of charged particles from the sun. Earth is protected by a strong magnetic field, but Mars lost its magnetic field billions of years ago. So without protection, solar wind from the sun hit Mars's atmosphere directly and slowly, basically blasting its own atmosphere into space. MAVEN measured atmospheric escape in real time, and especially during solar storms.
So you've talked about one of Maven's biggest discoveries, which are that these solar storms, which are an increase of the activity on the sun, dramatic increases the atmospheric loss on planets. Yeah. Can you talk about some of the other discoveries that Maven has made?
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things that MAVEN also did was that it observed Martian auroras. Unlike Earth's northern lights, the auroras would spread globally because Mars lacks a strong magnetic field, which is honestly really cool. It also studied hydrogen escaping into space. It helped reconstruct ancient Martian climate and supported the idea that Mars once had stable liquid water.
Yeah, so that's really cool that we're like slowly gathering evidence about Mars's past. And also, there seems to be not definitive evidence, but some evidence to help show that there might have been life on Mars in the past. And it's cool that MAVEN was able to contribute to some of that buildup of evidence. We've talked about MAVEN's discoveries, but has MAVEN also been able to maybe help some of the other missions that we've sent to Mars?
Yes, it did. It was honestly very important, and I'm worried for the future of the two NASA Mars rovers that are currently on the surface, Curiosity and Perseverance. Basically, we have a good number, or NASA has a good number of orbiters. Mars, well, I mean, I guess not really. Basically, you have the two Mars rovers sitting on the surface of Mars, how do you get the signal? Okay. How does mission control and Curiosity and Perseverance talk to each other? It's harder to talk without satellites. I mean, it's not like we can just build a giant disk array on the surface of Mars. Basically, a bunch of the other scientific missions sent to Mars would relay communications with Perseverance and Curiosity all the way back to Earth. And from my understanding, I could be wrong here, but from my understanding, MAVEN was one of the biggest data emitters, quote unquote, for transmitting data from Mars to Earth. But it's not like we just entirely lost all contact with Perseverance and Curiosity. But it's still a little bit worrying now because now we're down one satellite.
Yeah, so communication between our rovers, which are Curiosity and Perseverance, and Earth, think of it like a radio wave. And as it travels through space, it can get not necessarily distorted, but there are other signals from space can interfere with that, as well as traveling through atmospheres can also interfere, not a ton, but an amount that can cause some kind of fuzziness, maybe a little bit of static. And so something that MAVEN did was create a place where the signal could be captured and then re-relayed so that it didn't have to travel continuously and instead had a pit stop where it could maybe be cleaned up in a sense and not. And it's just another place so that if something did happen, it could be dealt with before having to send it all the way back to Earth.
I guess be like, how can we solve this issue? It's not really an issue right now. It's not like we need to have constant communication with Mars because we don't have anyone living there currently besides just a couple robots. But eventually, we are going to need to improve this communication system. So actually, recently, SpaceX announced that over the past few years, they have their Starlink system, right? They've been launching, I think they have 18,000 Starlink satellites in orbit so recently they announced that they are going to eventually start sending Starlink satellites around the moon to build a better, stronger communication system for the moon. So eventually I would assume in the coming years, SpaceX would do the same and try to send a bunch of Starlinks to Mars also. But yeah, MAVEN was important in not just doing its own mission, but helping other missions communicate all the way back to Earth.
I like the kind of concept of not only, in a sense, doing your own thing, but also making sure that whatever you're doing, or in this case, whatever MAVEN was doing, also supported the other spacecrafts around them. I think that's a really cool concept and also an interesting way that the scientists and engineers at NASA designed MAVEN to be able to have this flexibility.
Now, Pascal, I have a question for you. Mars has always captured human imagination. Why do you think missions like MAVEN resonate culturally, not just scientifically?
Yeah, so I think has a very large scope. Like, why do we look up into the stars and ask questions, right? Why do we look at these planets and try and figure them out even more? And I think I'm going to go back a little bit into some histories. And I believe it would be in the early days of people thinking about space, would be in around the era of the 50s. Everybody thought that Venus was going to be the next planet that humans would be on, right? They thought it was a super green planet and that was going to be the planet that humans were going to explore. In fact, Ray Bradbury actually published one of his most famous stories, All Summer in a Day, which was set on Venus. But as our understanding grew and we figured out more about the planets, Venus turned out to not be that and not be able. But then we looked and we saw Mars, and Mars has those ideas that kind of maybe we could live there. Maybe it could be a next step. And so I think Mars really symbolizes that ability to explore beyond our little bubble, right? We have the moon, we've been to the moon, and that is super cool in its own right. But it's another thing to imagine a whole new world, right? Even those words, you think of all the books you read that have, if you read fantasy, if you read sci-fi, they're all set on worlds that are cohesive. And I think that Mars being a world, another place that people could exist or maybe have existed, is really interesting and captures that almost not quite childlike, but that deep rooted inspiration and want to figure things out and explore. And I think a lot of what Mars really captures that. And more science fiction has talked about this, famously The Martian by Andy Weir, and that has made a huge impact. That was made into a movie, which then actually catapulted a lot of Andy Weir's work into, we talked about a couple episodes ago, the Project Hail Mary, which is definitely in the kind of headspace of the public right now. And I think you can see this through a lot of fiction and a lot of art, but this idea of new world, and Mars encapsulates that as a close to home, but still whole new place to explore. And I think MAVEN also, because of its relation to Mars, represents humanity trying to figure out what's going on this other planet. And there's also this cool idea that MAVEN is trying to figure out past history, right? And so it's looking at these little clues that are left behind and how it's currently changing to figure out how it got from what we think it could have been, which is this humid climate, semi-similar to Earth's, to this dry, super arid red planet that we see in the sky now. And so there's this idea that I find really interesting, which is that Mars could be almost a future Earth, or Mars could have been our Earth in the past.
Yeah, great insight there. Thank you. There's something poetic about studying a planet that lost its atmosphere. What themes stand out to you there?
Yeah, well, of course, there's the obvious kind of like poeticism of you need air to breathe, right? We breathe in our atmosphere all of the time. And so if you lose your air, if you lose your atmosphere, when humans don't have air, we suffocate and die. And so it's the same idea of we look into the past and we can see that Mars has changed so much because of its lost atmosphere. And so it's so interesting to think about how this one thing that we don't even think about that often, like day-to-day life, you don't look up and go, I wonder if our atmosphere is being slowly whittled away by the sun. And so to think about that and to think about, in a sense, how fragile some of our world is, fragile in the grand scheme of things, of course, it's taken millions, billions of years for Mars's atmosphere to break down. But there's still this idea that it's crazy that something so big could be worn away in this way where it's it's such it's planetary. That's like, it's so big, it's hard to conceptualize. And that being stripped away is crazy. I've also mentioned the parallels to Earth, where of course, we have climate change these days, and that is more commonly on our mind. And once again, being able to look to Mars as maybe, in a sense, a warning of what breaking down something fundamental to a world can do to that world. Because we're looking back and we're seeing that Mars might have had life. Maybe, almost definitely not life like we have life on Earth, but life that was removed because of something environmental, right? The atmosphere. And we're also doing something to our atmosphere that's causing our world to heat up. And so looking at Mars and thinking about, oh, this could be an example of our future planet, that we need to take care of our own kind of atmosphere and our own world, because this is a world that once had life and no longer does. And so in this sense, Maven and spacecraft's life, Maven, can become like extensions of humanity, where they're both encapsulating our curiosity, but also our spirit of trying to look back and trying to figure out what happened so that we can make sure we keep our planet safe and make sure we keep our planet kind of, make sure we take care of our own planet, and also know what the consequences of not taking care of our planet might look like.
Thank you. That was really good. Okay, then I have another question. When NASA declared that they did lose MAVEN, people reacted emotionally. Why do you think humans get attached to spacecraft?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what I've been talking about. About so often spacecraft and missions into space kind of capture all of these ideas about representing our human curiosity, our want to explore, but also our looking back. And so I think when you lose a spacecraft like Maven, oftentimes people can have this kind of loss, that you've lost some of these emotions associated with it, that maybe you've lost a connection to something that is important to you. You're like, oh, we can't explore this in this certain way. And that can be really heartbreaking. As well as, of course, there's the scientists whose lives were Maven. Literally, they went to work. Their work was Maven, right? And there's always that. And then there's also the idea that if you saw a spacecraft go up, right? We had this with the recent Artemis mission, where we saw it go up, right? And that kind of seeing progress, but then future years, if something stops working, it sometimes has that, oh, I saw that go up. I have this emotional connection to it that now I don't really know what to do with because it's not there anymore. And yeah, so I think that's part of the reason why there's can be losses associated with it. But I also think it's important to remember that the loss of the spacecraft, sad, yes, but also it means that, first of all, that spacecraft, Maven, did so much for understanding Mars, right? And also that everything has, in not trying to be morbid, but everything has its end. It has its lifespan. And I think Maven set out what it was trying to do and has had closed full circle. And I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it, to help not just be sad, as well as Maven will catapult new missions into figuring out, because Maven also, it had its goals, and now we can specify the goals that we want to do in the future. So specify what we want to have in the future, what missions we want to look into. And so I think that's another way of looking at it. And so I've talked a bit about the fact that Maven was lost, but what exactly happened? So I've talked a little bit about the loss of Maven, but Wyatt, could you talk a little bit about what actually happened to Maven and maybe why it happened?
Yeah, I guess it's probably a good time to get into why it died. So basically, on December 6th, 2025, NASA lost all contact with the spacecraft. It happened after the spacecraft was passing behind Mars. So when it was passing behind Mars, it did lose communication. It was in a little blackout event where Mars was in the way of Earth. So Maven couldn't transmit data back to Earth. NASA did, though, recover fragments of tracking data. Evidence suggested that it was spinning. It was in an unexpected spin. There was a possible change in its orbit, and the battery was just depleted. They tried multiple times to recover it, but it didn't work out. So on June 3rd, NASA officially declared that the mission was at its end.
Like that can happen. And I feel like a lot of people were surprised because maybe not the scientists, but it's kind of up in the sky and you kind of feel like it's going to be there forever. Speaking of forever, will Maven stay in Mars's orbit or is it going to leave its orbit or what's going to happen in the future?
No, it won't stay in Mars's orbit forever. Its orbit is expected to decay over the next 50 or 100 years. And after that, it would just eventually crash into Mars. But yeah, I have a proposal. There's really no point to it, but it's technically, in the future, it would be possible that we could just rendezvous with it. If we could still be able to track it, yes. And then we could just collect it and then bring it back safely onto the surface of Mars when we have a full sustainable colony, or we could ship it back to Earth if we wanted to. And then we could actually figure out what went wrong with it. Because what was the most surprising part to me was that it was spinning. So could have the rotation system just malfunctioned and just it executed a spin for no reason and it just shook itself apart, or maybe it just I would assume honestly probably just an electrical issue. It's 11 years old, 12 years old. It probably just it has to be some malfunction with the electrical and gyroscopical system. But technically in the future with SpaceX's Starship, we could definitely rendezvous with it, safely collect it into Starship's payload bay, and then bring it back. So then you could put it into a museum. It did some cool things. So why not? If you have the time, it wouldn't cost that much money. Honestly, go recover this spacecraft that just randomly went offline. And then it's a cool story to tell. Yeah. Anyways, I think that is going to be the end for now. This was a really fun discussion. Honestly, yeah, I really do hope we can eventually recover it with a giant rocket and see what I really want to know why it just started spinning. But thank you for joining us on season 2, episode 12 of the Space on Earth podcast. I've been one of your hosts, Wyatt Wade.
And I've been your other host, Pascal Heitzman.
And we will all see you next time. Thank you.